Hello, it's Amy, and I'm here with Agnes Replier's book, To Think of Tea. This is a publication from 1932, and I was able to find it in a library discard. I also have accompanying me here a matcha grapefruit tea, which is pretty good. It's just a bag tea that I found at the grocery store recently. And I think I've drunk my way through the box of this matcha grapefruit tea in just about a week here. I've got one bag left, so I'm definitely going to be going and purchasing more of that because it's quite a nice green tea to be drinking in the evenings here. So this is a book by a female essayist from the early 20th century, and it's exactly what the title implies, To Think of Tea. It is all about tea, thinking of tea, and thinking of people who drink tea. There's a little bit of history and quite a bit of storytelling in it. For instance, she talks about famous English literary figures such as Samuel Pepys and Dr. Johnson and Gladstone and how they all liked their tea. And I put a few sticky notes in it as I read because I quite enjoyed it. And I learned quite a bit about the history of tea in England. There were things called coffee houses, which were mainly for men, and they emerged in the 1600s as sort of an alternative to your tavern or your pub. So somewhere you could go to hang out, talk with your friends, but not necessarily drink alcohol. And the counterpart to the coffee house is the tea garden or the tea house, which were geared more towards women. So women could go and hang out with their friends in a respectable way without alcohol involved. And so the drinks, tea and coffee, in a way formed how people were interacting with each other in public spaces. And there was quite a bit of controversy around the introduction of tea to the English cuisine. There were some people who thought it was detrimental, partly because it was taking away from the profit that the creators of alcohol were getting, and others who thought that tea was detrimental because it made women idle and it made them gossips because it really did encourage people and provide an avenue for them to just sit and talk. And so I think it comes even today into our culture today where we talk about, tea as relating to gossip. There's that phrase, spilling the tea, you're going to spill the tea. And so it sort of comes back to this idea of women who would sit and just enjoy tea together. And of course they would get talking, and that talking would often lead to this gossip, this tea spilling, so to speak. And there is a section here about the first coffee house that opened at Oxford in 1650, which I found quite interesting, and about how there were successors to that coffee house that emerged elsewhere. And I'm just flipping through to see what I got. It was fun because I have not only my own notes, but a previous reader has marked some things off in pencil, some passages they found interesting. There's reference in here to the publication, The Spectator. The Spectator was ever and always the friend of tea. It affiliated itself adroitly with the custom of drinking this soothing stimulant twice a day. In March 1711, Londoners were advised through its familiar pages that all well-regulated households served tea in the mornings, and that all intelligent households took care that a copy of The Spectator should invariably be part of the tea equipage. And so they marketed themselves along with tea. And there's also a section in here on tea smugglers. So tea was heavily taxed, and a lot of people, especially people of lower incomes, but also, the wealthy and the middle class, didn't really want to pay the high prices that tea that was heavily taxed would cost, and so they would buy it from smugglers instead. And so it was sort of this recognized, respectable part of society that there would be people who would smuggle tea in, and in some communities there's sort of an agreement that you don't talk about it, you don't claim to see anything, and you just let the smugglers do their thing, and therefore you can buy your tea. And then, of course, there is a small chapter here on the United States and their relationship with the tax on tea. But what I found most interesting are a few chapters about specific personages. So we have here, for example, chapter 5, on a tea drinker of England. A hardened and shameless tea drinker who has for many years diluted his meals with only the infusion of this fascinating plant, whose kettle has scarcely time to cool, who with tea amuses the evening, with tea solaces the midnight, and with tea welcomes the morning. And I have to say, I'm not too far off from this idea of the kettle never cooling. I am constantly heating my kettle all day long. And sometimes I think I drink more tea in a day than some of my friends drink in an entire month. But the famous tea drinker that Repplier is referring to here is, of course, Dr. Johnson, who is known for his massive consumption of tea. And Repplier recounts a few stories in here about the stress that his love for tea would often put on his host and hostesses, wives who would find themselves pouring cup after cup of tea into the early hours of the morning, when Dr. Johnson, who was known for keeping late hours, would show up at their door. And let's see, what else do I have here? Here we go. Dr. Johnson's life is punctuated by tea. Whether we look for him in London or at Streatham in Boswell's company or in Mrs. Thrale's, we find him drinking it. He began his innocent potations an hour or so before getting up, commending them especially as being relished at that time, continued them for a goodly portion of the afternoon, and wound up his nights with as many cups as he could get anyone to make him. When he was under his own roof, which was not often, he dispensed gallons of tea. It was commonly his only mode of entertainment, though he did surprise Boswell, whom, by the way, he first met over a cup of tea in the back parlour of Davy's bookshop, with a well-served dinner of a soup, a boiled leg of mutton, spinach, a veal pie, and a rice pudding. After he gave up his house and went to live in chambers at Inner Temple Lane, it was his habit to drink tea every night with Mrs. Williams at her lodgings in Bolt Court before going home to bed. This circumstance is adduced by his biographer as a proof of Johnson's extraordinary goodness of heart, but we must remember in the first place that the thing he never wanted to do and put off as long as possible was going to bed, and in the second place that the poor old lady must have sat up very late night after weary night to wait his coming. So these people who would out of goodness, out of politeness, serve him tea into the early hours of the morning. We have a section here on Cooper. Since, however, it was ordained that Cooper should translate the Iliad, and since it was his good fortune to find 500 compatriots ready and willing to subscribe 3 guineas apiece for the translation, it is well to know what was the first thing he did with his access of wealth. So the first thing he did when he gets this money, these subscriptions for his translation of the Iliad, he writes to Lady Heathcliff to buy him a grand new tea urn, so a pot to brew his tea in. The one we have at present having never been handsome and being now old and patched. A parson once, as he walked across the room, pushed it down with his belly, and it never perfectly recovered itself. So this idea that Cooper loved his tea so much, the first thing he did upon getting money is to ensure himself the ability to brew tea and to brew it better than before. On a gay tea drinker of England, thank God for tea. What would the world do without tea? How did it exist? I am glad I was not born before tea. And that's a quote by Sydney Smith here. And I do like how each chapter has various tea-related illustrations. Jane Austen died 2 years before George Eliot was born, and 1 year after the birth of Charlotte Bronte. She was of the old order as surely as her sister novelists were of the new. She was content to observe and chronicle where they must needs protest. Her unrivaled powers of observation found material in the simplest circumstances of life. She always maintained that she liked not only tea, but tea parties. She always denied that they were dull, and they probably were not when she was present. And she goes on to talk a little bit about Jane Austen here, and closes the book with some general statements about how great tea is, and I'm sure all us tea lovers will agree with this. Tea is friendly to the rich and serves the hospitable instincts of the poor. Humble folk cannot afford to give dinners. Ale bouts exclude women. Tea is their social offering, their comfortable incentive to gossip. And more about fashionable tea rooms here, how much people want tea, how it's sometimes difficult to get tea. But this is an interesting point here. Even when you can't really afford to entertain your friends for dinner, you can afford to entertain them for tea. When your apartment is too small to serve a proper dinner in, such as mine, I can still have people over for tea because that is perfectly fine, to drink in chairs, to drink seated on the floor, that sort of thing. And almost everybody likes tea of some sort. Although there is a little discussion in here of how some people would judge the poor for their consumption of tea. Judge the poor and thinking, tea is an extravagance. And people who are poor, people who are receiving charity, it was the opinion of some people, in the 17th and the 18th century, that they should not be consuming tea at all. And they should only be consuming things that are nutritious rather. Which I think is absolutely absurd, because everyone, even people with lower income, should be able to enjoy a good cup of tea, because it's a relatively high amount of pleasure for such a small price. But tea has been legislated through bills, and tea has, according to the ramblings of this book, tea has had a significant social role in the development of English society. And so I quite enjoyed this. I've had a couple of other people reach out to me to talk more about books on tea. Apparently it's an entire genre, and it's just by coincidence that I read this a couple of days ago, and now I was just turning on my turning on YouTube on my TV, and I was seeing Taking Tea with Catherine on her channel talk about English tea afternoon tea and high tea is what she was talking about. And she showed a number of books from her own collection, specifically on tea, which I thought was interesting as well. And it seems to indicate that books on tea are an entire genre, an entire potential avenue for collecting. And although I did enjoy this one, I don't think I'm going to be diving too much further down the rabbit hole of books on tea. If I see one now and then, I might pick it up. But although I love tea, I much prefer drinking the tea rather than reading about it. And for me, the most interesting parts were the biographical snippets, the passages about famous tea drinkers, as opposed to the history of tea itself.